On a storm-lashed night in 1856, a young single mother boards the last train to London with her feverish child and nowhere left to go. Exhausted, she falls asleep on the shoulder of a stranger who is, in truth, a widowed duke, whose heart has been buried for years. One impulsive act of mercy will bind their lives together, awakening forbidden feelings, dangerous gossip, and a choice between dignity and desire. Is this shelter, or the beginning of another heartbreak? Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and do you believe a single act of kindness can change a life forever in a historical romance? England, winter of 1856. The night was bitter and unrelenting, the wind lashing against the train carriages like an angry tide. Rain clattered against the soot-dark windows, and the lanterns inside flickered with each rumble of the wheels over the iron rails. The line from Bath to London had been delayed twice due to flooding near Chippenham, and yet Evelyn Carter remained seated, cradling her infant daughter in her arms, as if the child were the last ember of warmth left in her life. Lucy stirred weakly, her cheeks flushed with fever, her small mouth opening in a soft, rasping breath. Evelyn pressed her lips to the baby's damp forehead, whispering lullabies that trembled in her throat. Her eyes, honey-brown and rimmed with fatigue, scanned the nearly empty carriage. She had chosen the farthest compartment, hoping to avoid the stairs she had grown used to, the ones that lingered on the hem of her worn slate-grey dress, or on the mismatched gloves she wore, or worst of all on the blanket-wrapped child in her arms. Across from her sat a solitary gentleman, upright and silent, half obscured by the dim gaslight and the collar of his dark navy coat. He had boarded quietly at the last stop, nodding curtly to the porter, and had not said a word since. Evelyn had dared only the briefest glance in his direction. His posture was stiff, like a statue carved from ice, and his eyes, shadowed, distant, unreadable, stared not at her, nor at the child, but out into the storm, as though seeking something long lost in the night. The rhythmic clatter of the train lulled Evelyn into stillness. Her arms, aching from holding Lucy since dawn, began to tremble. She blinked slowly, fighting sleep, but the weight of the past days, the hunger, the cold, the fear, pressed upon her like a shroud. Her head nodded forward once, then again, until, without meaning to, she leaned gently against the stranger beside her. At first she did not realize she had done it. The wool of his coat was warm beneath her cheek, steady, like the memory of safety she had once known. It was not until Lucy gave a sudden twitch in her arms, her tiny body slipping toward the floor, that Evelyn's eyes flew open in a panic. But before she could move, before her cry could form, a hand shot forward and caught the infant mid-fall. It was the stranger. He did not speak. His hands, strong and gloved, cradled the child with an ease that startled Evelyn. She froze, her heart thundering. Her bonnet slipped slightly askew as she tried to rise, to apologize, but words tangled in her throat. The man turned slowly toward her, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. He was not young, nor old. There was something ageless about him, something carved by grief. His features were chiseled, aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a jaw that clenched as if to hold back emotion. His grey-blue eyes, hollow yet piercing, met hers with a silence that burned more than words. There was no scorn in them, no amusement, only recognition. As if he, too, had once clung to something fragile and nearly let it slip. The baby whimpered. The stranger did not flinch. He returned Lucy to Evelyn's arms with reverent care, and then, after a long moment, he reached above them and pulled the emergency bell. The train slowed minutes later. Evelyn, still stunned, clutched Lucy close as the gentleman stood and offered her his gloved hand. She hesitated. He did not demand, did not explain. He only waited. Eyes unreadable, jaw tense, the collar of his coat lifted against the chill. Outside, rain slashed sideways across the platform. A dark carriage stood waiting, lanterns aglow. Evelyn followed him without understanding why. The porter tried to question the gentleman, but he answered with a clipped instruction. "Tell the station master, Duke of Rathbourne." The words landed like thunder. Evelyn froze, Lucy's breath warm against her neck. She had heard that name before. In papers, in whispers. The Duke who had vanished after the death of his young wife, a man of immense wealth, boundless land, and no heirs, a man who, they said, had buried his heart with a coffin 3 winters ago. Yet now, that very man opened the door of his carriage to a governess with a child born out of wedlock, and not out of charity, not out of pity, but something else, something unnamed. Evelyn stepped inside. The interior smelled of leather and cedar. Lucy let out a sigh, her fevered head resting against her mother's breast. The Duke remained silent beside them, his posture still, yet no longer distant. He looked once at Evelyn, then once at the child, and then he closed the door with a decisive hand. The horses pulled forward. The rain did not cease, nor did Evelyn's confusion. But in that carriage, on that road to Belgravia, the quiet was no longer hollow. It was the sound of breath returning to a man who had forgotten he could feel, and the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. The first sensation Evelyn Carter felt upon waking was the weight of silence. Profound, cavernous silence that seemed to press against her ribs and settle deep in her chest. It was not the familiar silence of poverty or illness, but a different kind entirely. This silence was curated, intentional, the kind found only in houses where people once laughed, then stopped, and never resumed. She lay still beneath a thick coverlet of pale ivory wool, her fingers clutching its edge as if afraid it might vanish. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a low, burning hearth where the fire crackled in gentle defiance of the cold outside. Tall windows were dressed in heavy velvet drapes the color of mulled wine, half drawn to keep the morning light at bay. Everything around her, wood-paneled walls, polished furniture, a faint floral scent of lavender water, spoke of quiet luxury. Yet it was not opulence that made her tremble. It was unfamiliarity. She turned her head cautiously and saw Lucy, nestled in a cradle beside the hearth. Her daughter's cheeks, though still flushed, no longer burned with fever. The child let out a soft sigh, her tiny fingers twitching in sleep. Relief swelled in Evelyn's throat, bitter and sweet. She wanted to rise, to hold her, but found her limbs unwilling, as though the weight of uncertainty had seeped into her bones overnight. The door opened without a sound. A young maid in a dove-grey uniform stepped in, her movements careful, respectful, rehearsed. She carried a tray of warm broth, dry toast, and a steaming cup of tea. "Good morning, miss," the girl said, avoiding Evelyn's gaze. "His Grace asked that you eat. Doctor said rest is needed." His Grace. The words echoed, unwanted. Evelyn sat up slowly, the quilt falling from her shoulders. "Lucy, still sleeping. Doctor's elixir helped. Fever's lower." Evelyn's voice was hoarse. "Thank you." The maid nodded and slipped out without another word, leaving behind not only the tray, but the heavy air of unanswered questions. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted the spoon, forcing herself to swallow. She could not afford the indulgence of fear or pride, not with Lucy depending on her. Yet her mind reeled with confusion. What sort of man brought a stranger and her child into his home without warning? What did he want? What would he expect in return? She rose and moved to the cradle. Lucy slept soundly, her breathing even, her brow less furrowed than the day before. Evelyn brushed a curl from the child's forehead and pressed a kiss to her warm temple. "You're safe," she whispered, though she did not know if it was true. Later that morning, a knock at the door preceded the appearance of a second maid, older and more composed. Her name was Mrs. Redley, and she introduced herself as the housekeeper. "His Grace is away in his study," she said briskly. "Dr. Chamberlain will return this evening. In the meantime, should you or the babe require anything, ring the bell once." Evelyn nodded, struggling to meet the woman's eyes. Please thank the Duke for his generosity." Mrs. Redley paused. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or something softer. "You may do so yourself," she said quietly, "when he is ready." And with that, she departed, leaving Evelyn once again in the hush of a house that breathed in controlled stillness. By the afternoon, Evelyn could bear the stillness no longer. She paced the nursery, carried Lucy from room to room within the nursery suite, and gently opened the tall oaken door that led into the hallway. Her breath caught. The corridor was long, with high ceilings and arched doorways framed in carved wood. Chandeliers hung at measured intervals, each drop of crystal like frozen rain. The carpet beneath her shoes muted every footfall, yet her presence felt loud, an intrusion into something sacred and closed. She descended a small flight of stairs and found herself in a drawing room unlike any she had seen, its walls lined with books, its windows overlooking a small, snow-dusted garden enclosed by stone walls. The fire burned low there too, as though in every room the flame had been forgotten and left to dwindle. She sat in one of the armchairs and held Lucy close, rocking her in silence. Then, without quite realizing why, Evelyn began to hum. Just a lullaby, soft and familiar, a tune her mother had once sung in better days. The notes warmed the air, filled it with something human, something alive. Behind the door, someone stopped. She did not hear him approach. But the moment the lullaby floated out of the drawing room, the Duke, Alistair Wycliffe, stopped walking. His hand hovered above the polished banister, his breath catching in his throat. He did not enter, did not speak. He only listened. It had been 3 years since music had sounded in this house. When he returned to his study, he did so with a heaviness he had not felt in months. Not the grief of absence, but the unbearable ache of presence. The kind that makes a man remember what it was to be warm, and to wonder if such warmth could ever return. That night, Evelyn found broth delivered again, this time with a soft roll and a folded napkin embroidered with the Wycliffe crest. A note lay beneath the plate, unsigned. "Dr. Chamberlain says the child's lungs are clearing. Fever is manageable. You should sleep tonight." She read the note twice. Not a command, not even a direct address, just a quiet insistence. And it startled her more than a declaration might have. Sleep came in fitful stretches. In the middle of the night, Evelyn awoke to find Lucy coughing softly. She rose, bundled the child in her shawl, and walked with her up and down the nursery. As she passed the window, she saw it, one solitary lamp still burning in a room across the courtyard. He had not gone to bed. The next morning, the routine repeated. Meals arrived. The doctor returned. The fever had broken. The baby would recover. Evelyn bathed Lucy herself, her hands gentle, her eyes misting with gratitude and fatigue. She sang again as she dried her daughter's skin, the melody curling in the corners of the room like steam from warm tea. She did not notice when Mrs. Redley paused outside the half-open door, nor when a scullery maid lingered in the corridor just a moment longer than she needed to. But the household was listening. By the 3rd day, Evelyn requested fresh water for washing. By the 4th, she offered to mend a torn cuff on a footman's uniform. When Mrs. Redley protested, Evelyn replied, "I need to feel useful. I have always worked. I cannot forget myself into leisure." The housekeeper said nothing, but the uniform was delivered anyway. From a distance, Alistair Wycliffe watched, never directly, never near enough to make her uncomfortable, but he noticed the difference. Where the nursery wing had once been silent, now there was the sound of water drawn, of lullabies drifting, of footsteps creaking faintly on polished wood. And in the drawing room, the scent of broth lingered longer. The fire, which had been allowed to die nightly, was now tended until morning. He had not spoken to Evelyn Carter since the carriage ride. He did not trust himself to. Something in her presence shook the foundation he had so carefully sealed with silence. She was not a noblewoman, not a society figure, not someone who could offer him status or strategic alliance, but she had entered his home like a single candle placed in a vast cathedral, and the shadows had begun to retreat. He walked the corridor that evening and paused once more outside the nursery. Evelyn did not know he stood there. She sat in a rocking chair, Lucy asleep on her chest. Her face was turned toward the fire, soft in its amber glow. Her hair had come loose from its braid and curled around her temples in gentle wisps. Her eyes, no longer sharp with fear, stared into the hearth as if seeking answers the flames could not offer. Alistair turned away before she could sense him, but his hands, once buried in his coat pockets, now trembled slightly at his sides. That night, Evelyn whispered into the silence, "This house is not empty. It just forgot how to be full." And the house listened. Morning arrived cloaked in pearl-grey mist, its quiet breath pressing against the tall windows of the nursery. The frost had retreated, but the air remained crisp, as if the season itself were holding its breath. Within the stone walls of the Wycliffe estate, the hours passed in a rhythm that Evelyn Carter had slowly begun to understand. Silent footsteps on polished wood, hushed conversations at doorframes, and a household bound not by chaos or joy, but by restraint. It was on that morning, the 6th since her arrival, that Evelyn rose before the servants came. She had slept lightly, her dreams restless, filled with shadows that wore polite faces. But Lucy had slept soundly, and that was enough to steel her heart. After wrapping the child snugly in a shawl, Evelyn moved through the halls like a wisp of memory, unseen, unheard, and yet gently altering the air around her. She descended to the lower level, where linens were stored and uniforms folded. There, in the quiet dimness, she found a basket of torn garments awaiting mending. No one had asked her to touch them. In truth, no one had spoken to her beyond necessity. But Evelyn was a woman who had learned long ago that gratitude must be sewn with thread and labor, not only words. She sat in the corner of the room, lit a small oil lamp, and began to work. The fabric whispered beneath her fingers, stitch after stitch, repairing what had been unraveled. It soothed her. It anchored her. She mended 3 shirts, a torn apron, and a set of gloves before the housekeeper arrived to find her seated, back straight, eyes lowered, her daughter napping beside her in a woven cradle lined with soft wool. "You needn't," Mrs. Redley said after a pause, her tone not harsh but uncertain. Evelyn lifted her gaze. "I do, for myself." The woman said nothing more, but the next day, the mending basket was left on the chair beside her chamber door. When not tending to Lucy or sewing in the servants' wing, Evelyn wandered the house with quiet purpose. She dusted the edges of bookcases in unused rooms, rearranged scattered volumes, and gathered stray buttons and pins left forgotten. Every act was small, nothing dramatic. But slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to stir. Fires were lit a little earlier. Tea trays arrived a little warmer. The silence, once so heavy, now shared space with the soft rustle of presence. Still, Evelyn remained invisible to the world outside the walls of the estate, and yet to one man she was becoming impossible not to see. Alistair Wycliffe watched her from the shadows of his study and the upper landings of the staircase. He observed her as she moved with practiced humility, never commanding attention, never asking for more than what was needed. She was neither fragile nor hardened. She was something in between, like glass tempered by fire. He noticed how she folded linens with a grace born of discipline, how she carried her child not as a burden, but as a sacred extension of herself. She never lingered where she was not needed. She never opened doors she had not been invited through, and that made her all the more present. It was on a morning brushed with the golden promise of early spring that Alistair stepped into the south garden, an area he rarely visited since it had once belonged to her, his late wife. The roses there had grown wild from neglect, their thorny branches reaching out like memories untamed. He had not expected to find Evelyn there. She was kneeling in the soil, the faded hem of her grey dress brushing the ground. Lucy slept in a cradle beside her, shaded by a canopy of bare branches. In Evelyn's hand was a pair of shears, dull and rusted with time. Yet with them she worked gently, trimming only the excess, cutting back the thorns, but never uprooting the plant itself. Alistair did not move. He remained still, watching as she leaned closer to the bush, whispering something he could not hear. Her touch was reverent, not fearful, and when she reached for a fallen petal caught in the damp earth, she lifted it as though it had weight, as though it mattered. She turned then, sensing him, and froze. Their eyes met, hers wide, unsure, his unreadable. The breath caught somewhere in his chest. She stood, brushing soil from her gloves. "I didn't mean to intrude. I only thought the plants might survive the season with care." He said nothing, but the stiffness in his posture softened, and after a moment he nodded. "You did not intrude." She inclined her head and gathered Lucy in her arms. As she passed him on the path, she whispered, "Forgive me, Your Grace," and continued walking toward the house. Alistair remained alone in the garden for some time, staring at the bush she had pruned. It looked less angry somehow, less abandoned. That evening he returned to his study and pulled from his desk a single sheet of parchment, the first he had touched in days. But before pen could meet paper, a knock at the door shifted the air. Mrs. Redley entered, her hands clasped before her. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. A letter has arrived." Alistair took it. The wax seal was unmistakable. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe. The name alone sent a chill across the room. "She intends to arrive on Thursday," the housekeeper added, hesitant. "Says she has concerns about your silence." Alistair folded the letter slowly. "Of course she does." He dismissed the woman with a curt nod, but long after she had gone, he remained standing, the letter unopened on his desk. In the guest chamber, Evelyn rocked Lucy slowly, her body weary but her spirit oddly alert. Something had shifted. She had seen it in the Duke's eyes when he found her in the garden. Not softness, not yet, but something that trembled just beneath. The next morning, her answer arrived in silence. A maid brought her fresh garments, plain but finer than anything she had worn in years. A breakfast tray followed, set with porcelain and silver, not wood and tin. And on the dresser, a small bouquet of pale roses waited in a crystal vase. Evelyn approached them carefully, as if unsure whether they were real. Her fingers brushed the petals. No note, no signature. But she understood. Later that day, she ventured into the library to return a book she had found mislaid. It was there, standing between towering shelves, that she overheard the butler speaking low to a footman just beyond the arch. "Lady Beatrice arrives on Thursday. We'll see how long the girl stays after that." The words struck like ice. Evelyn stood motionless, her heart pounding. Lady Beatrice. That name, though unfamiliar, carried weight. A titled relation, someone close enough to judge. Her breath caught. Until now, she had assumed the Duke was a man of status, perhaps a wealthy landowner, a gentleman of influence. But the weight behind the title, Your Grace, had not truly settled until that moment. And suddenly the truth unfurled like a slow, inevitable tide. She had been living under the roof of a duke, and not just any duke, one whose name was spoken in London's highest drawing rooms, whose reputation was that of a recluse, a man of loss, a figure cloaked in silence and speculation. She pressed her palm to her chest. The cradle of comfort she had begun to build around herself cracked, and yet something deeper stirred. Not fear, not quite, but something dangerously close to awe. She turned back toward the nursery, her footsteps slow, the knowledge clutched tightly within her. For now she would not speak of it, not to the staff, not to the Duke. She would carry the truth silently, the way she had carried so much else in her life, with dignity and restraint. But as she closed the nursery door behind her, Evelyn Carter understood one thing with chilling clarity. She was no longer merely a guest. She was a presence. And that, in this house of mourning and memory, was its own form of revolution. The wind shifted that morning, as if the house itself had been warned. The skies above Belgravia were clear, but there was a sharpness in the air, a sort of anticipatory tension that slipped through window panes and echoed along the polished corridors. The staff moved briskly, voices hushed, movements efficient. Fires were stoked higher than usual, silver was polished twice. Even the footmen straightened their posture with a reverence tinged with dread. She was coming. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe, Dowager Countess of Greystone, aunt to the Duke and guardian of the family's reputation, had not stepped foot inside the Wycliffe townhouse in nearly 2 years. Her visits were as rare as they were formidable. And now, summoned by whispers and an unspoken sense that the house had changed, she arrived without warning, but with absolute purpose. Evelyn Carter was in the nursery, rocking Lucy gently as the child napped against her shoulder. The fire crackled softly beside them, its warmth brushing her cheeks. The air smelled faintly of lavender and ash. For a brief moment, all felt still, safe, until the knock came. It was not tentative. It was not polite. Mrs. Redley appeared in the doorway, colour drained from her already pale face. "Lady Beatrice has arrived," Evelyn blinked. "Lady—" Before she could finish, the unmistakable sound of a walking cane tapping sharply against marble filled the hall. A presence swept through the corridor like a gust of cold air, and then she appeared, tall, severe, and draped in mourning black despite her widowhood being over a decade past. Lady Beatrice Wycliffe entered the nursery without request or ceremony. Her eyes, pale and piercing, scanned the modest room as if it were a battlefield. Her gaze fell upon Evelyn and narrowed. "You may leave the child with the nurse," she said, not as a suggestion but as command. Evelyn stood slowly, her hands instinctively tightening around Lucy. "She is asleep." The older woman's expression did not shift. "And yet you continue to cling to her as if you fear she will vanish. Or perhaps be taken from you?" The words were not loud, but they carried a weight that struck like thunder. Evelyn's spine straightened. "I only meant to soothe her." Lady Beatrice took 2 steps closer. "You meant to soothe the child. But what precisely do you mean to do here, Miss Carter? Mend linens, rearrange books, nurse a child not of your station beneath this roof while occupying a chamber meant for guests of pedigree?" Silence fell. Even the fire seemed to hush. "I have not asked for anything," Evelyn said softly. "No," Beatrice replied, her voice like cold steel. "That is what makes you dangerous." The door behind them opened. Alistair stepped in, his presence quiet but commanding. He did not speak at first, merely took in the sight before him, Evelyn pale and steady, with Lucy pressed to her chest. Beatrice, rigid with judgment, standing as if she had been carved from stone. "Aunt," he said at last. She turned to him, not with warmth, but with a righteousness she wore like a crown. "Alistair, we must speak." His eyes did not leave Evelyn. "Later." Beatrice hesitated, but years of Wycliffe discipline held. With a sharp nod, she turned and swept from the room, her cane clicking a rhythm of disapproval as she disappeared down the corridor. Evelyn exhaled. Her knees nearly gave way, but she held firm. Alistair approached, his steps measured. "She had no right," he said quietly. "She did," Evelyn answered, though her voice trembled. "It is her family, her home." His brow furrowed. "You are under my protection." She looked up then, her eyes not pleading but resolute. "And that, Your Grace, is precisely the problem. I have no name here, no history, no invitation. I am a woman beneath the stairs, living behind a closed door in borrowed peace. And she sees that. London will see that." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he could not. The rules of his world had been carved long before either of them were born. "I'll gather our things," Evelyn said gently. "Lucy and I have overstayed your kindness." She left the nursery without waiting for permission, her steps slow, but each one echoing with a quiet finality that made the walls themselves ache. By evening, the house had dimmed. The staff spoke in whispers once more, and in her chamber, Evelyn folded garments that barely filled a satchel. Lucy slept in a cradle nearby, unaware that the fragile stability they had found was being unraveled thread by thread. Evelyn paused, holding a shawl in her hands, the one that had kept Lucy warm on the train. Her fingers clutched the fabric, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, shoulders bowed. The fire was lit, but its warmth did not reach her. She had known this moment would come. No house this grand, no name this old, could truly make space for someone like her, a woman with no husband, a child with no legacy. Dignity could only take one so far before the world reminded her of her place. In the nursery, the flames flickered low, casting shadows across the walls. Evelyn entered with Lucy in her arms, unable to sleep. The baby stirred, unsettled, and Evelyn sat before the fire, rocking her slowly, and that was how Alistair found them. He did not knock. He did not announce himself. He entered the room and paused just inside the doorway, watching them in the golden glow. Evelyn did not look up. She knew he was there, knew the sound of his footsteps, the weight of his presence. After a moment, he crossed the room and knelt beside her, not with grandeur or ceremony, but with a gravity that shook something loose in the air. It was the first time in years that Alistair Wycliffe, the 9th Duke of Rathbourne, had lowered himself to the floor for anyone. He reached out and gently touched Lucy's hand, his fingers brushing the child's skin with reverence. The baby curled her tiny fingers instinctively around one of his. "She's warm," he said quietly. "She's safe." Evelyn's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Not for long. He looked at her then, not as a duke, not as a man above her station, but as someone stripped bare. "I don't want you to leave." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. They sat like that in the hush of firelight, two souls tethered by silence, by longing, by everything neither dared speak aloud. Lucy's breathing deepened. The shadows danced across the walls, and somewhere in the great aching house a door that had long been closed cracked open, not a door of wood or iron, but one of memory, of feeling, of hope. The thaw had begun. It began with a knock. Not the discreet rap of a servant nor the hurried knock of a courier. This was something heavier, measured, entitled. The kind of knock that announced not only the presence of someone from another world, but someone convinced he had every right to cross into yours. The sound echoed through the marble entryway, across the vast stillness of the house. Evelyn heard it from the upstairs corridor, where she had just finished smoothing Lucy's covers in the nursery. A chill passed through her, not from cold, but from something nameless, instinctive. She stilled, listening as footsteps approached the grand front doors, then paused. Voices, murmurs, then silence. A moment later, Mrs. Redley climbed the stairs with surprising haste, her expression tightly composed. She approached Evelyn with a curtness she rarely employed. "There is a gentleman downstairs," she said. "He has asked to speak with you." Evelyn blinked. "With me?" The housekeeper's lips pressed together. "He said his name is Mr. Theodore Harland." The air fled Evelyn's lungs. Her knees weakened, but she did not collapse. Instead, she nodded once and followed the woman down the stairs, step by trembling step, as if each one led her closer to a memory she had buried in soil too shallow. The drawing-room door stood ajar. Inside, standing with one hand casually tucked into the pocket of his buff waistcoat and the other toying with a golden watch chain, was the man she had once loved, or thought she had. Theodore Harland. His fair hair was perfectly parted. His blue eyes sparkled, not with warmth but calculation. His smile, too wide for the moment, held nothing of joy. He turned as she entered, his gaze sweeping over her in a single practiced gesture. "Evelyn," he drawled, "you're looking surprisingly well." She did not respond, her hands clenched at her sides, hidden by the folds of her skirt. He took a step toward her. "May I sit?" "No," she said, her voice low and unshaking. "Say what you came to say." He chuckled, as if amused by her defiance. "Very well, direct as ever. I heard a rather peculiar rumor through a mutual acquaintance. Imagine my surprise when I learned you were residing in the Duke of Rathbourne's townhouse, with a child." His eyes flickered. "My child." Evelyn's breath caught. "She is not yours." He raised a brow. "Legally, that may not be for you to decide." She flinched. It was subtle, but he noticed. "You've lived comfortably here," he continued, pacing toward the window. "And I'm certain you've told the Duke a tragic tale. But circumstances change. I'm engaged now to a young woman of fine reputation. Her father is a member of Parliament. It would not do for certain past indiscretions to surface. You understand?" "Do I?" Evelyn whispered, every word scraped from her throat. "I need you to disappear, Evelyn. Quietly, gracefully. I'll provide a stipend, enough to make yourself scarce. You and the child can live somewhere unremarkable. In exchange, I'll make no legal claim, but if you resist—" He turned back to her, eyes cold. "Then I will pursue custody, publicly." The door creaked behind them, and suddenly the air changed. Alistair Wycliffe stood in the doorway, silent, still, but radiating something so potent it made Theodore retreat half a step without realizing it. The Duke entered slowly, his expression unreadable, his cravat pristine, his coat dark as thunderclouds. His grey-blue eyes landed on Evelyn, not with alarm, but with the quiet inquiry of a man who had already begun to suspect something, and now saw it unravelling before him. He shifted his gaze to Harland. "You are addressing a guest in my house. Kindly explain yourself." Theodore smiled with professional polish. "Your Grace, my name is Theodore Harland. I have reason to believe Miss Carter is caring for my illegitimate daughter under your roof. I am simply seeking an arrangement that protects everyone's interests." Alistair did not blink. "Your interests are not welcome here." Harland's mouth twitched. "With respect, there is none." The silence that followed was glacial. Alistair stepped forward, his voice low, controlled, lethal. "You've come into my home with veiled threats, without invitation, and you presume to dictate the fate of a woman you abandoned. That makes you neither man nor gentleman." Harland stiffened. "Be careful, Your Grace. My position is not without influence." Alistair took another step. "Neither is mine." For a heartbeat, neither man moved. The air between them was charged, as if one more word might ignite it. Then Theodore exhaled, adjusted his cuffs, and gave Evelyn one final glance. "You've made your choice, I see. Let us hope you do not regret it." He left without another word. The sound of the front door closing was louder than thunder. Alistair remained in place for a moment, his chest rising and falling with slow restraint. He turned to Evelyn then, his voice gentler than she expected. "Are you all right?" She nodded, but tears burned behind her eyes. Yes, thank you. Do you want to sit?" She did not answer. She did not need to. Alistair guided her to a chair beside the hearth, and only when she was seated did he crouch beside her. Not kneeling this time, but close. Closer than any man had dared come, since the day she was left alone with a child and no name. He waited, and then she broke. The words came in a rush of breath and anguish, long withheld. "He told me he loved me, promised marriage. I was naive, yes, but not foolish. I believed him. I gave him everything. When I told him I was with child, he laughed, said I'd misunderstood, that I was no longer suitable to be seen with. He left me in Bath, with no money, no letters, no name to give the midwife. I lost my position. I nearly lost my child." Alistair closed his eyes, jaw clenched. "I have never asked for sympathy," she continued, "but I will not be ashamed of her. I will not." He opened his eyes. "You never should be." She looked at him then, raw and unguarded. "I did everything I could to protect her, to protect myself. And still, he found us." Alistair's hand moved, not to take hers, but to rest lightly on the armrest beside her, close enough to feel the heat between them. far enough to let her choose. "My wife," he said quietly, "died in childbirth, along with our son." Evelyn's breath caught. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. And in that moment they sat there, two people shaped by grief, haunted by different losses, bound by the invisible weight of what might have been. Evelyn reached out, not for his hand, but for the silence between them. "I'm sorry." His eyes met hers. "So am I." But the sorrow was no longer empty. It was shared. And for the first time it did not feel like a burden. It felt like something survivable. Together. The invitations had been sent weeks before, embossed with golden ink and the weight of obligation. The Wycliffe name, though cloaked in retreat these past years, still carried enough gravity to bend the season around it. And so, when Lady Beatrice Wycliffe announced that her nephew, the elusive Duke of Wraithbourne, would attend the charity ball in Mayfair, the social pages erupted like dry paper kissed by flame. The ballroom had been prepared with painstaking care. Crystal chandeliers floated like stars above polished marble floors. A string quartet rehearsed behind embroidered silken screens. Tables gleamed with silver candelabras and arrangements of cream roses, their petals misted to perfection. Every detail whispered wealth, power, and a hunger for re-emergence. But in the servants' hallway behind the velvet-draped walls, Evelyn Carter stood breathless, her hands folded tightly in front of her apron. The air was thick with perfume and expectation. She could hear the laughter of women in jeweled gowns, echoing from the grand staircase, the rustle of silks brushing past carved columns, the subtle clink of crystal being prepared. The entire house thrummed like a vein just beneath skin. She had not been meant to come. That much was clear. Her place was not among the guests, nor even the prominent staff. She had been invited, or instructed rather, to assist behind the scenes, tucked in the machinery of the event, like a cog no one noticed, but everyone needed. Evelyn accepted the role with quiet dignity. It was safer that way. Her simple grey dress had been pressed, her bonnet replaced with a ribboned twist pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Lady Beatrice had provided the instructions herself, her eyes hard, her mouth tight with civility. "You'll remain unseen, Miss Carter," she had said, her voice cold but not cruel. "It's what's best, for the child, and for him." Evelyn had nodded, but in her heart the words had carved a hollow she could not fill. And yet she came, because Lucy was here, and because the Duke had not looked away when she had confessed the worst of her past, because he had not pitied her, and because, despite everything, part of her wanted to see the world that had always been closed to her, even if only through the narrow window of a servant's corridor. From her post, she could glimpse the edge of the ballroom through a sliver in the velvet curtain. The guests glittered like constellations, their laughter brittle with performance. Alistair stood near the centre, tall and composed in his evening coat, his waistcoat of deep navy embroidered subtly with silver. His cravat was folded with precision, his gloves immaculate. He moved with the ease of someone born into expectation, but his eyes, those grey-blue eyes, were not settled. They searched the room without appearing to, and then they paused. For a brief second, Evelyn thought he had found her in the shadows. But no. He turned away again, his attention caught by a Viscount's greeting. The spell broke. She stepped back into the corridor, heart pounding for reasons she could not name. She should return to her duties, to the small room where trays were arranged and notes delivered. But before she could turn, she heard it. A cry. Not loud, not shrill, but unmistakable. Lucy. Evelyn moved instantly, her feet flying down the narrow staircase toward the nursery, tucked beside the retiring rooms. One of the younger maids stood there, flustered and flushed. She woke, wouldn't settle. I tried. Evelyn took the child into her arms, whispering soothing nonsense as she cradled her close. Lucy's cheeks were damp, her eyes wide with confusion. Evelyn pressed her lips to the child's brow, rocking gently. The little girl's cries softened to whimpers. And then Evelyn turned and found herself face to face with the wrong door. It was not the hallway she had come from, it was the ballroom. The grand double doors stood slightly ajar, and in her haste, Evelyn had passed through the wrong corridor, entering through the side, intended for orchestra staff. She stepped back instinctively, but it was too late. Gaslight reflected off every polished surface. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Conversation froze mid-word. Music stuttered into silence. She stood beneath the glow of a chandelier that might as well have been moonlight, her arms wrapped around Lucy, her dress plain, her cheeks flushed with colour, not from rouge but from shame. The whispers began like wind in the trees. Who is she? Is that a child? Why is she here? And then, his voice. Evelyn. It was not sharp, not surprised. It was a murmur, threaded with something deeper. She turned. Alistair was already crossing the floor. The crowd parted not from invitation, but necessity. He walked toward her without haste, but with unwavering direction. His eyes never left hers. When he reached her, he looked not at the child, not at the startled crowd, but at her. "May I?" She hesitated. Then slowly, she nodded. He reached for Lucy and cradled her in his arms, with a tenderness that did not belong to ballrooms or society or reputation. The child rested her head against his shoulder as if she had always belonged there. Gasps echoed through the room. A marchioness dropped her fan. A viscount spilled his champagne. But Alistair Wycliffe did not flinch. He turned to face the crowd and said nothing. He did not owe them words. The image was enough. The Duke of Rathbourne, once the most inscrutable man in London, stood in the centre of society's judgment, holding a child in one arm and defiance in the other. And Evelyn Carter, standing behind him, was no longer hidden. Lady Beatrice rose slowly from her seat near the dais, her gloved hand gripping her cane. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the silence of the room consumed her voice. Her eyes fell on Evelyn, no longer with scorn, but something closer to alarm, or revelation. The orchestra, confused but trained, resumed their music, slowly, cautiously, and still Alistair held Lucy as she drifted into calm. He turned to Evelyn then and returned the child to her arms, his hands lingering for a moment too long. His fingers brushed hers, not by accident. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching. "Do not hide," he whispered. Then he turned and walked away, not back to the dais, not to the circle of lords and ladies awaiting an explanation, but to the doorway from which she had entered. He held it open and waited. The room watched. Evelyn took a breath. Then, with Lucy in her arms, she crossed the ballroom floor. Her steps were slow but steady. Her head was high. Her presence undeniable. And when she reached the Duke, he offered no escort, no performance. He simply walked beside her, as if it had always been so. The chandeliers burned above them, but it was the light in their silence that dazzled most. And behind them, London society burned with questions they would never have the courage to ask aloud. The house stood wrapped in silence, but not the kind that had haunted it before. This silence trembled, frail and uncertain, as if breath held in too long had finally been exhaled and now lingered, waiting for what might come next. The ballroom, once crowded with jewels and judgment, had been returned to its hushed, candlelit state. Servants moved with restrained discretion. The chandeliers had been dimmed, the guests had long departed, and with them the heavy perfume of society's expectations. Only the echo of what had happened remained, clinging to every corner, like the faint scent of roses after the vase has shattered. In the drawing room, Alistair stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the flickering glow of gas lamps on the street below. The city beyond was alive with talk. He could feel it pressing against the glass, trying to seep into his sanctuary, but for the first time in years, he didn't care what they said. He had stepped into the fire, and it had not burned him, not completely. Behind him, the door opened. He did not turn. He knew it was her. "Your Grace," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the weight of so many things unspoken. "You need not call me that tonight," he replied without looking at her. She hesitated. "What should I call you then?" He turned at last. She stood in the doorway, still in the modest grey gown she had worn behind the scenes of the ball, her hair now unpinned, falling in quiet waves past her shoulders. There was no pretense, no ornament, only the raw truth of who she was, and it made her the most luminous figure he had seen all evening. He crossed the room slowly. "I brought you shame tonight," she said, before he could speak. "I did not mean to. I never wanted—" "You brought me clarity," he interrupted gently. She looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You defended me. You held her. In front of everyone. I would do it again." There was a silence then, rich and thick and pulsing. He stepped closer, but not close enough to touch. "Evelyn," he said, her name as reverent as a prayer. "What I did tonight was not for spectacle. It was not out of charity, and it was not born of impulse. I have watched you carry the weight of survival with grace. I have seen you soothe a child with nothing but the warmth of your voice. You've brought life into these walls where there was only dust. You have reminded me of who I once was, and who I might still be." Her eyes lifted to his. "I want you to stay," he continued, and now his voice trembled, not with weakness, but with sincerity. "I want you and Lucy here, under this roof, safe, provided for, protected. I can give you everything you need, comfort, security, a home, not as my wife, not yet, but as someone who belongs." She flinched. The words, so tenderly offered, struck like thunder. He saw it, saw the hurt flicker across her face before she could hide it. "Not as your wife," she repeated, barely above a whisper. "I do not wish to bind you to scandal," he said quickly. "You deserve more than to be paraded as an answer to gossip. This house, my life, is not easy, but I could offer you peace. And perhaps something like happiness." Her eyes filled with tears. "You offer me walls, Your Grace," she said softly, "but not a name." He stepped forward, finally closing the space between them, his hand outstretched, but she stepped back. "I will not be kept," she said, her voice breaking. "I will not be hidden. I know what I've lived. I know what I've lost, and I know what it cost to stand on my own. You say you see me. Then see this. I would rather return to obscurity than be half-claimed by a man afraid to choose me entirely." The words shattered between them like glass. Alistair lowered his hand. "I only meant to protect you," he said, the pain in his voice undeniable. "I've had enough of protection," she replied. "I want truth." She turned then and fled the room, leaving behind only the echo of her refusal and the hollow ache of what might have been. Night fell fully over London, and with it, a fever returned. Lucy stirred restlessly in her cradle, her cheeks too warm, her breathing shallow. Evelyn sat beside her, a candle lit on the table, her hands trembling as she pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's forehead. "Please," she whispered to the child, "not again, please." But the child whimpered, her small body restless beneath the quilt. Alistair had remained in the drawing-room long after she had gone. The silence no longer offered refuge. It accused, condemned. It rang with the sound of her voice, clear and strong, refusing to be something temporary. He did not sleep. When Mrs. Redley came to find him near dawn, her face pale, she spoke only one word: "Lucy." He was at the nursery within moments. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering candle and the red embers of the hearth. Evelyn sat in the rocking chair, her face drawn, her arms around Lucy's fevered body. Her eyes were glassy with exhaustion. Alistair stepped inside. She looked up. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Then he walked to her side and knelt again, not as a duke, but as a man stripped of title and defense. "Let me help," he said. She hesitated, then slowly offered Lucy to his arms. He took the child gently, settling her against his chest, humming something low and wordless. Evelyn watched, her heart clenched, her hands now empty. He sat with her through the night, never once leaving her side. He fed the fire. He changed the cloths. He held Lucy as Evelyn drifted into a shallow sleep beside him. Her head slipped onto his shoulder, her breath brushing his neck. He did not move. And in that fragile moment, when both mother and child rested against him, something inside him healed. The sun rose, brushing the windows with golden light. Lucy's fever broke just before dawn. Her breathing steadied. Her skin cooled. Evelyn awoke slowly, her head resting against Alistair's shoulder, her fingers curled into the folds of his coat. She did not remember falling asleep there, but when she opened her eyes and saw him watching the child, his gaze filled with quiet awe. She knew nothing in the world could be more sacred than this moment. He looked at her then, his eyes red-rimmed, his expression unguarded. "She's strong," he whispered, "like her mother." Evelyn swallowed hard. She said nothing. Outside, the first birds began to sing. The fire had dimmed, but the warmth remained. And in the stillness of the nursery, life stirred, not just in the child, but in the man and the woman and the house itself. Not a single vow had been spoken, but something had been promised nonetheless. The storm did not announce itself with thunder. It came instead in silence, wrapped in tailored wool and accompanied by men who wore the scent of ink, law, and ambition. Their carriage arrived mid-morning, its wheels silent against the cobblestones of Belgravia. By the time the butler opened the door, Mr. Theodore Harland had already stepped out, followed by two gentlemen in dark coats who carried leather-bound portfolios like weapons. Inside, the Wycliffe household paused. Word spread quickly through corridors and drawing rooms. Servants exchanged glances. Mrs. Redley tightened her jaw. In the nursery, Evelyn Carter felt the shift in the air before anyone spoke her name. Her arms tightened instinctively around Lucy, who was playing quietly near the fire. A soft knock came at the door. "Miss Carter," the maid said gently. "There is someone downstairs. Mr. Harland. He has brought a solicitor." Evelyn did not ask questions. She stood, gathered Lucy, and descended into the unknown. The drawing room was too bright. Harland sat with legs crossed, hands gloved in soft leather, eyes shining with something far too smug for civility. One of the solicitors stood at attention by the hearth. The other had taken a seat and was already laying out papers on the low table, their edges aligned with almost obsessive precision. When Evelyn entered, they rose, but not out of respect, out of strategy. "Miss Carter," Harland said, smiling like a man about to win something, "how good of you to come. I trust you've had time to reconsider our last conversation." Evelyn said nothing. Lucy shifted in her arms. Harland continued, his voice smooth. "As I mentioned previously, I'm preparing for a respectable marriage, one that could be complicated should certain matters from the past resurface. And while I admire your decision to keep the child out of the public eye, I can no longer permit the risk of unpredictable behavior." One of the solicitors cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Miss Carter, we are prepared to present a formal petition for custody. Given the lack of paternal acknowledgement at birth, and the child's current residence under another man's protection, it could be inferred that stability is a concern." Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. Harland leaned forward slightly, voice soft and sharpened. "You see, it isn't scandal I fear, Evelyn. It's the appearance of impropriety. And unfortunately, impropriety has followed you like a shadow. But if you act wisely now, you may walk away with your dignity. I'll make a generous settlement. You'll be free to live somewhere quiet, alone." Evelyn looked down at Lucy. The child's cheeks were still pink from recovery. Her fingers clutched Evelyn's collar, her small mouth slightly open in sleep. She had no defense but her mother's arms. Evelyn's legs felt hollow. "I won't subject her to a public fight," she whispered. "If it's peace you want, I'll yield." The words tasted like ash. But before the solicitor could speak, another voice cut through the room like tempered steel. "She will not yield." All eyes turned. Alistair Wycliffe stood in the doorway, tall and composed, though his face bore none of the restraint he had worn in Mayfair. He crossed the room without waiting for permission, each step measured, each movement coiled with unspoken threat. He stopped beside Evelyn and looked directly at Harland. "You brought lawyers into my house uninvited. That was your first mistake. The second was assuming I would let you use the law as a cudgel against someone under my care." Harland rose, still wearing a practiced smile. "Your Grace, this is a private matter." "Not anymore," Alistair replied. "You made it public the moment you stepped through that door." He turned to the solicitors. "I suggest you advise your client to withdraw." The younger solicitor blinked. "Your Grace, our client has documentation." Alistair produced a folded letter from his coat pocket and handed it to the man. "So do I. Here is proof that Mr. Harland falsified correspondence to secure business funds under another man's name. I have sworn affidavits from 2 associates and a debt ledger from a bank in Bristol. Furthermore, I've sent word to the Lord Chancellor's office regarding a separate complaint involving tampered court records from 3 years ago." The solicitor paled. The older gentleman leaned in, reading rapidly. Alistair's voice was calm, but icy. "You may pursue custody if you wish, but know that every courtroom you enter will receive these documents. Every magistrate will be made aware of your history, your debts, your duplicity. And should any harm, legal or otherwise, come to Evelyn Carter or her child, I will ensure that your name is not just tarnished, Mr. Harland. It will be obliterated." For a moment, no one breathed. Evelyn could only stare, not because he had defended her, but because he had done it without fanfare, without grand gestures, without asking for her permission, but never once taking away her voice. The elder solicitor stood, folding his portfolio. "We will be taking no action at this time." "Indeed we will not," Harland muttered, the corners of his mouth twitching in suppressed fury. "You've made your position clear, Your Grace." Alistair's eyes darkened. "Make no mistake, this is not a position. It is a vow." The men left quickly. The door closed behind them with a definitive finality. Evelyn stood still. Lucy pressed to her shoulder, her breath uneven. Alistair turned to her. She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand gently. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. She looked at him then, truly looked, and her eyes filled with something weightier than gratitude, something that trembled between awe and disbelief. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do all that?" He was silent for a long moment. Then with great care he spoke. "Because for the first time since I buried my son, I've come to believe that love is not the absence of grief. It is what grows when we choose to protect what we have left." His eyes held hers, and in that gaze, Evelyn saw not a duke, not a savior, but a man offering something far rarer than wealth or shelter. Safety without ownership, loyalty without expectation, love without demand. She blinked, tears threatening. And for the first time since Harland had entered her life, Evelyn Carter felt not afraid, but fortified, not by a title, not by power, but by the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who had chosen her, not for what she lacked, not for what she could give, but because she had dared to survive, and in doing so had taught a house how to live again. It was just after the noon hour when the letter arrived. Folded crisply in plain parchment, bearing no seal, no crest, no trace of elegance, only the quiet handwriting of someone who had once called Evelyn family. The scrawl bore the name of her cousin Annabel, a widow managing a small boarding house in Devon, offering Evelyn modest lodging and perhaps some work tending to tenants. It was not a future of comfort, but it was a future she could claim without owing anyone anything. Evelyn sat at the edge of the nursery hearth, the letter open in her lap, her gaze fixed on the embers as they collapsed into ash. The room was warm, too warm, yet she felt a familiar chill behind her eyes, the kind that arrived not with the cold, but with resignation. Lucy slept quietly in the cradle beside her, one small fist curled near her mouth, her breath even at last. For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the weight of peace, the silence of a sleeping child, the velvet hush of a house no longer grieving, the scent of lavender water drifting from clean linens, and the soft rustle of firelight on wool. It should have been enough to quiet the questions in her heart, but it wasn't. She had not come to Belgravia for comfort. She had come by accident, by necessity, by sheer fatigue. She had come as no more than a burden, and no matter how gently Alistair Wycliffe had cradled Lucy in the nursery, or how long he had stood outside Evelyn's door in recent nights, saying nothing but breathing near her presence, she remained what she had always been, a guest, a risk, a woman with no name that society would honor. She moved slowly across the nursery and began to fold Lucy's gowns. Her fingers trembled over the thin seams, mended and remended with invisible thread. She packed in silence, pausing only to glance toward the child, as if memorizing her in this setting, this room where she had almost died, then lived again. When the door creaked behind her, Evelyn expected a maid. Instead, it was Lady Beatrice. She stood with her hands folded tightly at her waist, her expression unreadable. Her presence had never been soft. Too many years of London seasons, of court introductions, of shielding the Wycliffe name from gossip and scandal. But tonight there was something changed in her bearing, not weakness, not approval, but a surrender to something older than pride. Evelyn straightened her shoulders. "I'll be gone by nightfall." Beatrice stepped further into the room, her boots quiet against the carpet. "I know." She extended a gloved hand, offering a small velvet pouch. It looked ancient, faded rose-colored silk, the drawstrings frayed, the corners rubbed thin. Evelyn did not take it. "What is this?" Beatrice exhaled softly, then placed the pouch on the hearth. "A Wycliffe token, passed from mother to daughter, or, in some cases, given to the woman a Wycliffe man cannot forget." Evelyn's hands stilled at her sides. "He has chosen you," Beatrice said. "I questioned it, fought it, tried to reason with him, but it is not reason he needs, it is breath, and for the first time in years, he breathes." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she said nothing. "You're afraid," Beatrice continued, her voice thinner now, "and I understand that though I've never admitted fear myself, you're afraid that this, whatever this is, will collapse in the sunlight, that you'll wake one day and remember who you were before all this. But so will he, and when he does, you'll be beside him, if you let yourself." Silence. Then Beatrice turned and left. Evelyn sat again at the hearth, her hands trembling. The pouch remained untouched between them. She stared at it for what felt like hours. Downstairs, the murmur of voices echoed faintly from the drawing room. Alistair was reading. She knew the timbre of his voice now, low, firm, wrapped in melancholy. He had taken to reading to Lucy as if to teach her that men could speak softly, that words could heal when touch still frightened him. Sometimes Evelyn would pass the room and linger just outside the door, not for the story but for the tone. It had grown gentler each day. With unsteady breath she stood, left the half-packed trunk, and descended the staircase. Each step creaked. Each corner of the grand house watched her like a witness. She reached the threshold of the drawing-room and paused. Alistair sat near the hearth, Lucy nestled in the crook of his arm, her little head resting trustingly against his chest. A book lay open in his other hand, though he wasn't reading. He was only watching the child. He looked up when Evelyn entered. The room dimmed. The fire flared. He did not rise like a duke, nor gesture like a man of nobility. He stood slowly, carefully, like someone shedding old armor. When he faced her, there was nothing aristocratic left in him. No distance, no reserve. Only the man who had first held her child on a moving train and whispered, "It's all right now." He stepped forward, crossing the space between them with reverence, as if one wrong breath might break her. "I thought," he began, then stopped. His voice cracked faintly. "I thought I'd forgotten how to speak plainly. But I see you, Evelyn, and I remember who I was before grief. You brought breath back to my soul." He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't want you to leave. Not ever." Evelyn did not answer with words. She closed the space between them in silence, her eyes shimmering but dry. Her hand found his, fingers trembling as they laced with his. The pouch remained upstairs, unopened, but its meaning was already here, in the room, in the fire, in the child now sleeping between their hearts. Alistair brought her hand to his lips just once, as if to seal a vow that needed no altar. Outside, London carriages moved like ghosts across the fogged streets. Inside, a woman once invisible stood in the centre of the Wycliffe drawing room, no longer a guest, but chosen, and the hearth, long cold, crackled gently in approval. Spring had arrived in Belgravia not with fanfare, but with gentleness, a hush of blossoms on the magnolia trees, a thawing of frost from iron gates, a softness to the wind that no longer howled through the corridors of Wycliffe House. Inside the private family chapel, where once grief had made its bed in the corners and shadows, the light now poured in like a silent benediction. The morning sun filtered through stained glass windows, scattering colour across the stone floor, rose and gold, lavender and cobalt, like the memory of joy returning to sacred ground. Evelyn stood at the threshold. Her gown was not adorned with pearls or sweeping lace. It was modest, tailored in soft cream satin, high-necked with delicate embroidery at the cuffs. Her dark hair was gathered at the nape, a few wisps escaping in reverent defiance. A borrowed veil fell down her back, the edges whispering against her shoulders with each measured breath. She was not the kind of bride whispered about in drawing rooms or immortalized in society papers, and yet, as she stepped forward, no one in that quiet chapel could look away. Lucy toddled ahead, the hem of her ivory frock brushing her ankles, a small basket of petals dangling from her arm. Her chubby fingers scattered the blooms in chaotic bursts, lilac, rose, violet, and her delighted squeals echoed through the vaulted ceiling like bells made of laughter. The pews, though sparsely filled, tilted forward to witness her joy. Lady Beatrice stood among the few invited guests, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles paled. Her face, carved in pride and restraint, betrayed the faintest tremble at the corner of her mouth. She had not wept at her own wedding, nor at the burial of her brother, but now she blinked slowly, once, as if to steady herself against the tide of something she could no longer name. At the altar stood Alistair. He wore no ceremonial sash or embroidered coat, only a deep navy tailcoat perfectly pressed and a waistcoat of pewter silk that caught the light with every rise and fall of his breath. His hands were folded behind his back, but his eyes, those storm-blue eyes, remained fixed on the woman walking toward him, each step she took dissolving years of silence inside him. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, only the voice of the Reverend, low and even, presiding over the exchange of vows, not as a grand event, but as something intimate, two souls choosing to no longer grieve alone. "I, Alistair, take you, Evelyn." The words came without hesitation. "I, Evelyn, take you, Alistair." The words came despite it, when he slid the ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold with a single inset sapphire. Her hand trembled only slightly, and when he lifted her veil, he did not kiss her lips at once. He touched her cheek, brushing away a tear not with the urgency of possession, but with the reverence of memory, of loss, and of second chances. Their kiss was brief, chaste, but it burned into the walls of that chapel like a sacred fire. Outside, the carriages rolled quietly away. There were no cheering crowds, no parade of titled guests, only the wind, carrying the scent of wisteria and the promise of a day unmarked by spectacle, but entirely altered by grace. The return to Wycliffe House was unceremonious. No ribbons hung from the gates, no music greeted them. But when they stepped through the great oak doors, something shifted. The butler bowed deeper than formality required. The footman straightened with care. The maids, many of whom had once avoided Evelyn's gaze, now met it, with cautious admiration, and something else, hope. The house did not erupt into applause, but it breathed. The drawing-room had been arranged with tea and scones, a modest display of celebration. Evelyn took no seat of honour. She removed her gloves, poured the tea herself, offered a cup to Beatrice before taking her own. There was no coronation here, only the slow, deliberate claiming of a home that had long stood cold. Later, when the guests had retired and the silver trays had been cleared, Evelyn found herself walking the hallways alone. She ran her fingers along the banister that once seemed taller than she dared touch, passed by the portrait of Alistair's father, who now seemed more memory than threat, paused beneath the chandelier where Lucy had once clutched a fevered blanket and wept into her shoulder. Now the child ran freely through the house, her laughter skipping ahead of her like ribbons in the breeze. Evelyn entered the nursery. The room was dimly lit, the last of the day's sunlight pooling on the rug. Lucy, drowsy from the long afternoon, curled in the corner with a stuffed velvet rabbit in her arms. Her eyes fluttered as Evelyn gathered her gently, cradling the child against her chest, as if she had done it every night for 100 years. Alistair entered without knocking. He stood in the doorway for a moment, one shoulder leaning against the frame. No longer the Duke of Wycliffe, nor the man who had once buried his past in legal briefs and silence, but a father, watching his world distilled into a scene he dared not interrupt. "Come," Evelyn whispered, shifting slightly. He joined her, lowering himself to the floor beside the rocking chair. Together they watched Lucy drift into sleep, her breath soft and steady, her small fingers curled around the lapel of Evelyn's gown. "She still reaches for you," Alistair murmured. "She knows what love feels like," Evelyn replied. The fire in the hearth crackled. Not grand, not roaring, just enough to keep the room warm, just enough to keep the dark at bay. Outside, London moved as it always did, judging, whispering, remembering old names and punishing new ones. There would be talk. Of the quiet wedding, of the woman no one had heard of before she walked down the Wycliffe aisle, of the child whose lineage was neither blue-blooded nor claimed in the columns of the Morning Post. But inside the nursery, no judgment reached them. Evelyn rested her head against Alistair's shoulder. He turned and pressed a kiss, soft and without urgency, to Lucy's hair. Then to Evelyn's temple. She did not cry. Not this time, because this time she was not being given a room out of charity. She had a home, she had a name, and she had been seen not just by a man, but by herself. As night fell over Belgravia, the house no longer echoed with emptiness. It sang, softly, steadily, with lullabies, with laughter, with the quiet triumph of a woman who had once walked through its doors as a stranger, and stayed as the Duchess who would never again be invisible. Autumn had arrived in Belgravia, dressed in rust and gold, painting the trees with quiet majesty. Leaves swirled along the cobbled walk in front of Wycliffe House, catching in the hem of a little girl's skirt as she darted past the gates with a shriek of laughter. Lucy was 8 now, taller, endlessly curious, with wild curls and questions that never ended. She ran barefoot through the garden, ignoring the protests of the governess and chasing her younger brother through rows of carefully trimmed hedges. "Frederick, come back with my ribbon!" The boy, just past his 2nd birthday, clutched the red silk like a trophy, his small legs wobbling in delight. He was the image of Alistair, those storm-blue eyes, that stubborn set to his chin. But the joy in him belonged to Evelyn. No ghost of sorrow lived in that child, only laughter, only light. From the window above, Evelyn watched them play, her hand resting on the glass, her wedding band glinting faintly in the late sun. 4 years. It had passed not in a rush, but in the steady rhythm of days well lived. The house had changed. New paintings now adorned the halls, brighter colours warmed once sterile rooms. A second nursery had been built, and the staff no longer whispered in corridors, but greeted the family with affection. She had changed too. No longer did she carry herself as a guest in someone else's life. The Duchess of Wycliffe was now a patron of literacy programs for unwed mothers, a hostess to quiet salons where working women and titled ladies sat side by side. Scandal had given way to respect, and in some circles, even admiration. Though not everyone had surrendered their prejudice, but time has its own tongue, and it speaks louder than gossip. In the drawing room, Lady Beatrice adjusted her spectacles and scribbled something fiercely into a letter. She still wore black most days, though she insisted it was simply elegant, not mournful. Her name now stood atop several charities that once would have sent her into apoplexy. She denied it had anything to do with Evelyn, of course, but her eyes softened each time the children ran into her arms with sticky hands and questions about dragons. And Alistair? He had become a man reborn, no longer ruled by silence, no longer drifting through rooms like a shadow of himself. His voice had returned to the estate, not in commands, but in laughter, in shared breakfasts, in bedtime stories and garden walks. He still governed land, signed documents, attended Parliament, but the weight on his shoulders no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to love. In the late afternoons, he would find Evelyn in the garden, pruning the same rose bush she had once tended in secret. He often stood behind her, silently, watching her fingers dance among thorns. And when she turned to find him, they would smile, not as if remembering a wound, but as if greeting something sacred. They had named their son Frederick James Wycliffe, and with his birth, the last thread of judgment seemed to vanish. There was no longer the girl from nowhere. There was only the Duchess, the mother, the woman who had once been invisible and was now the heart of a house reborn. But not all stories ended with redemption. The name Harland had long since vanished from respectable lips. After attempting to re-enter politics with the backing of an heiress bride, Theodore was brought low by a string of scandals unearthed by anonymous sources. Rumours suggested Alistair's reach had quietly extended into courtrooms and creditors' offices. Evelyn never asked. She did not care. Some names are better left behind. On this particular autumn day, the family was preparing to leave for their country estate. 4 trunks packed, 2 carriages waiting. The children were allowed one final dash through the garden before departure. Evelyn descended the staircase, gloved hands holding her travelling cloak. In the foyer, Alistair stood waiting, his arm outstretched to her as if it were still the first time. "Ready, Duchess?" She smiled. "Always." They stepped outside, and for a moment, just a breath, the world hushed around them. The leaves, the light, the laughter of children, it all folded together like the closing pages of a well-worn novel. London would continue to turn, judging or forgetting, but within the walls of their home, love had endured, not as spectacle, not as a fairy tale, but as truth, the quiet, stubborn truth of a man who once thought himself dead to feeling, and a woman who taught him how to live again. The wind lifted Evelyn's veil just slightly as they entered the carriage, and she turned to look back at Wycliffe House, not with fear, not with longing, but with peace. A home once filled with shadows now sang with light. A family that had come from ruin now bloomed in strength, and the woman who was never meant to be seen, she would never be forgotten. And so Evelyn's journey comes to an end, not with a grand proclamation, but with the quiet triumph of a woman who dared to stay when every door seemed closed, who turned judgment into grace and silence into a home filled with laughter. This is not just a love story between a duke and a governess. It is a story about second chances, about choosing courage over shame, about how even the most wounded hearts can find their way back to life, one lullaby, one whispered promise, one step at a time. If you've made it this far, let us know by writing the word breath in the comments, because sometimes that's all it takes to begin again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength it takes to love without fear, consider supporting the team behind these stories with a super thanks on YouTube, whatever amount you feel comfortable giving. Your generosity helps us bring more of these emotional journeys to life. And if supporting financially isn't possible, that's perfectly okay. You can still help by sharing this story with someone who needs to be reminded that love, in all its quiet forms, still matters. Don't forget to explore the other heartfelt historical romances I've left for you in the cards above. You might just find your next favorite. Thank you for being here, and remember, sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones whispered softly and felt forever.